the president of Interpeace. We are very pleased to be working with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sweden and with CIPRI on the organization of this year's Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development. Sustaining peace requires the establishment of social and political trust in governance institutions, the establishment of a foundation of safety and security and the rule of law, and the protection of human rights. We know that the primary responsibility for building peace rests and must rest with national actors, but that the international community has an important role to play, a positive one, and sometimes it does play a negative role as well. We have seen a spike in the number of internationalized conflicts since 2010 around the world. Think of Libya, think of Syria, Yemen, and also, of course, Afghanistan and Iraq as good examples of that. Now, one of the major contributions that the international community makes to peace and security in these countries are what we call stabilization operations. The most important and largest one in the world was the US stabilization operation in Afghanistan, which has lasted 20 years and cost over $800 billion. In the UN, where these missions are often called peace operations, the largest in the world is the one in the DRC, MONUSCO, which costs over $1 billion a year and has been active for 20 years now. Now, there's little denial that one has to restore basic security for peace to even be possible. There's no denying either that many peace operations are hostage to rotten or poorly designed peace processes and peace deals that preceded them. And yet, with the scale of the contributions that these missions make, the scale of the investments that they represent, it's important for us to be able to look with critical eyes at the degree to which they are actually fit for purpose. Do they contribute to sustainable peace? Do they actually achieve the objective that is sought for them? This is why I'm so excited to be hosting this debate today with 4 amazing speakers who have a lot to say on the topic. We're going to organize this debate in what we call the Oxford style of debating, meaning we're going to have 2 teams argue for and against a motion. The motion that we've crafted today is deliberately crafted in a controversial way in order to try to spark debate so that we can enlighten and educate about the issue, so that you, as the viewers, can make up your mind as to where you sit on the spectrum of issues that you're going to hear. We know that the way that we phrased this motion, that stabilization undermines peace, while controversial, it does not represent the views of the organizing organizations, be it Interpeace, the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, CIPRI, or anyone else. It also doesn't represent necessarily the views of the speakers, because we know that the truth is somewhere in the middle. And yet we want to have this debate in such a way that will almost exaggerate the points so that you can make up your mind even better. Now, we're asking the audience, all of you, to vote as to where you stand on this motion at the beginning of this debate. And we're going to ask you to vote again at the end of the debate. And the team that will win will not be the one that gets more votes. It's going to be the team that has swayed more people to their side. So we hope you enjoy this debate. I'm now going to introduce our speakers. We're going to start with the team that's arguing for the motion that stabilization does undermine peace. And we're going to start with Dr. Kwesi Aning, who's the director of the Faculty of Academic Affairs and Research at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center in Accra, Ghana. And he was also previously with the African Union. On the same team, we have Ms. Ginger Cruz, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Mantid International and is the former Deputy Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, a team with which she spent 8 years. Arguing against the motion that stabilization undermines peace, we have Dr. Almut Wieland-Karimi, the Executive Director of the Center for International Peace Operations, ZIF, based in Berlin. She's been the Executive Director since 2009. Before that, she was country director for the US and Canada of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and she's a board member of the Federal Academy of Security Policy and the German Armed Forces Command and Staff College, and of the Stiftung Mercator. And also on her team, arguing against the motion, is dear friend Alan Doss, the president of the Kofi Annan Foundation and a board member of Interpeace. Alan was formerly the SRSG of the UN in both Liberia and in the DRC, and deputy SRSG in Sierra Leone and Côte d'Ivoire. So they all have a lot to say on this topic. I'm really excited about this. Let us begin, and we're going to ask each speaker to spend 5 minutes making their case as to why they deserve your vote. And we're going to start with Dr. Kwesi Aning, who is arguing for the motion that stabilization undermines peace. Kwesi, over to you.
So thank you very much. I'm going to argue for the motion that stabilization undermines peace. And I'm going to give a couple of examples and reasons for that. So let me tell you why the other team's point is wrong. First and foremost, stabilization is what the UN seeks to do in states in which they are deployed. But the very foundation of the word has not been agreed to. Now, we all know that in every situation where there is no clarity as to what the core component of what one intends to do is not clear, there is a fuzziness, there's a lack of clarity, it brings confusion. But I want to drill down to 4 of the major peace operations in which the word stabilization actually appears in the title of the operation itself. In the Central African Republic, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and in Mali. What we see is that precisely because there is no UN-wide interpretation and understanding, common understanding of what stabilization means, we see a shift, a consistent shift and confusion in what this word means and how it should be applied. And I want to talk about 4 specific things. First is the issue of the use of robust force. That creates first a confusion as to whether we are talking about peacekeeping or peace enforcement. Now, that gap creates a lack of clarity as to how troop contributing countries and police contributing countries and their forces must operate within an operational theater. Now, taking into consideration the factors that lead to state fragility, collapse, resulting in the presence of international forces, we cannot and must not let this lacunae exist. Second is the rationale about collaborating and cooperating with state forces. Let me make this very clear. More often than not, the reasons that lead to state fragility and collapse is the lack of state ability to control its uniformed forces. More often than not, in MINUSMA, in DRC, and certainly in CAR. Security sector reform processes that go hand in hand with the presence of stabilization forces or so-called stabilization forces have not even started. Troops have not changed. Doctrines have not changed. Basically, we are giving an international veneer to a group of brutal forces who still continue to intimidate. Stabilization basically contributes to supporting the flouting of human rights, a disrespect for the rule of law, and creating unsafe situations. At present, such processes contribute to undermining and threatening these states. But even more disturbingly is the attachment to counterterrorism. Let me make this clear. Coming from a peacekeeping training school, where I train close to about 1,500 forces every year, counterterrorism training and understanding, and where at the African Union I also served as head of counterterrorism. The understanding about what this means and how it must be operated is diffuse, and is confused. Most of these troop contributing countries and police contributing countries don't have the skill sets, the tools, the equipment, and when they are attacked and their forces undermined, it creates even more instability, fear in communities and in societies. And let me give one more example practically. In northern Mali, where I've been working for several years, there is an increasing lack of stabilization precisely because the forces who are there just can't get a job done and done properly, creating actually a reverse development where Al-Qaeda roams freely, provides social welfare, is perceived as the state, and is actually glorified. Stabilization in Mali over the last couple of years, 5, 6, 7 years, has contributed to creating an unstable society where there is fear, where communities perceive their lives much more threatened. But stabilization is also a word that is used fairly flippantly, that there is no real understanding of what the content and approach to implementing this broad word must mean. Lots of areas where stabilization creates an enabling environment for insecurity to thrive and also to grow. And I think I will end my initial comments here and then take any subsequent questions that arise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kwesi. You've painted quite a powerful picture of how efforts to integrate former combatants into the armed forces is to actually give a uniform to a criminal and for them to continue their criminality. The fact that the bad behavior of stabilization operations or the lack of understanding of what the mandate is creating confusion with populations. I want to turn to the other team now. Almut, the floor is yours.
Stabilization supports peace. Let me start with a question to you. What world would we live in if the Americans had not helped the Europeans, especially us Germans, after World War II? What if the West had not supported the Western Balkans in the 1990s? And what if a huge alliance of states had not opposed the Taliban regime in Afghanistan after 9/11? Would there be more peace in these regions? Most probably not. To start with, I'd like to talk a little bit about what is exactly meant by the concept or policy approach of stabilization. 5 actors at least have 5 different definitions about what stabilization is. Let me just mention some buzzwords. It is about an intervention in response to failed or fragile states. It always takes place in conflict countries where there's violent conflict. It is a multi-sectoral effort, and it has an intermediate goal. Namely, the goal is just to turn violent conflict into non-violent forms of conflict management. It's only a starter to pave the way for sustainable peace. And I'm not going to talk about the definition of peace. I guess all of us agree we are talking here about positive peace, sustainable peace, peace owned by the respective local societies and governments. Now let us look at 3 examples in which stabilization activities certainly did support peace. Number 1, stabilization in the Western Balkans. It is a success story. Here we experienced the birth of the stabilization paradigm in the aftermath of the violent breakup of Yugoslavia. When the International Stabilization Force was deployed to Bosnia and Herzegovina and later to Kosovo, it definitely created a safe and secure environment. It created space for civilian actors to work there. And a significant amount of humanitarian development aid was funneled into the region. It supported economic reconstruction and very importantly, political initiatives were taken to build a stable post-conflict order. The outcome, the intermediate goal of stability, has indeed been achieved. Clearly, from a perspective of sustainable peace, the results are far from being perfect. However, conflicts in the region are now managed non-violently. And the stabilization efforts have allowed or paved the way for efforts for peace building, sustainable peace building. My second example is Afghanistan. I first been there 3 months after 9/11. People in Kabul were frightened, they were traumatized, they were impoverished, they were intimidated. Even women would not want to speak to me. At the same time, Afghans were hoping for the support of the international community, and they were grateful for the first efforts of help we would now label as stabilization efforts. Nowadays, 20 years later, I definitely do agree that Afghanistan is a very problematic country. There are many conflicts and Afghan people are suffering tremendously. Yet, stabilization has not been the wrong approach. At certain moments, we got the policy wrong. We were using timelines instead of benchmarks. Actors were competing for more influence and visibility, and we have never done our homework, a thorough conflict analysis. Nonetheless, would many Afghans want to go back to 20 years before? Or do they think that Afghanistan was a better place in 2001? Definitely not. Many surveys, especially by the Asia Foundation, do prove that very clearly. And as a born optimist, otherwise I wouldn't work in the field of peace and security, I do believe we can still get it right. Yes, there is a power vacuum the US is going to leave after their deal with the Taliban, and that might open a window of opportunity. My third and last example. A couple of days ago, we celebrated May 8th, 1945, 75 years after the Second World War, the defeat of the German and its allies, and the liberation of our country. What happened after World War II? The aim of the Marshall Plan in the post-war time was to politically and economically stabilize European countries that were devastated by the war. It was a reconstruction program. The US delivered humanitarian aid for starving populations. It created new markets and it tried to contain Soviet communism. Yes, this plan was definitely in the interest of the US. However, it also definitely stabilized Europe, including warmonger Germany, and it led to sustainable peace inside Europe. My last point, stabilization efforts in times of the corona pandemic. COVID-19 definitely has the potential to further destabilize countries. And let me tell you, in that situation, what alternative do we have to stabilization, combining humanitarian aid, peacemaking efforts, and international stabilization missions? Stabilization is a duty beyond borders. We even have to increase our stabilization efforts now in times of this horrible pandemic and growing nationalism to save and support as many people as possible. To conclude, stabilization does support peace. Thank you for your attention, and please vote for us and Ellen, go.
Very good. Thank you so much, Almut. And you've given some powerful, if controversial, examples. I know our next speaker, Ginger Cruz, who worked a great deal on Iraq, but is also very familiar with the case of Afghanistan, may have something to say about your example of Afghanistan as a positive one, despite the mistakes that you mentioned. So let me turn very quickly to Ginger to refute what you said, but also to add her own points. Ginger.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Well, I respect everybody's positions here, but having done this work in Iraq and having been very close to the work in Afghanistan, I really do seriously believe that stabilization, the way it's been executed in the last 15 years, really does undermine peace. And I'll give you 6 reasons why. So the first reason is a teaspoon of flour will not make a loaf of bread. And what I mean by that is the concept of stabilization is extremely noble. You're going to create a security environment that is going to allow a society to rebuild. You're going to help fund programs that will bring the infrastructure back and then help a society in a fragile state to put in the institutions that'll be necessary to have socio-economic success. To do that, you need a lot of money. In the example of Iraq, we spent $62 billion and you can't see it. We put sewers in, we did projects, we handed out money, we got the programs going, and you can't see it. You look at the trillions of dollars that are spent in Afghanistan, you can't see it. It's not enough money. The reason the programs post-World War II worked were because at the time there was a huge amount of money that was thrown at it. But in today's world, donor countries are just not going to put the money in order to make these successful. So what happens is you create an expectation in a group of people that are already battered and they're already a fragile state, and then you crush their hopes because the money that you do provide is not enough to really meet the aspirations, and then you fill the streets with angry protesters, as we're seeing now all across Iraq, all across Afghanistan. I mean, everywhere there's protesters because you haven't met their expectations. So it's over-promising and under-delivering, and it's a promise that really requires so much funding in order to achieve the goal that you're never going to get there. Second point, the spoiled child will remain spoiled. I meet with leaders of the government of Iraq today, 15 years after all of this started. And to this day, they're still waiting for the United States and the donor countries, and they want the next donor conference to see if everybody can just hand them $50 billion so they can do their infrastructure. And they're not ever going to seriously face their own problems and figure out ways to diversify their economy, cut back on their expenses, because they keep on thinking that just because we handed them money the last time, that everybody's going to hand them money again. And we weren't sure if that was going to resolve itself after a couple of years, but I can tell you, after 15 years, they still are waiting for everybody to hand them money. So that's the problem. The third part, what smacks of colonialism ends up legitimizing and fueling national militias and interests. When you invaded in the first place, you gave license to the terrorist ideology that sort of sits in everybody's mind. And these are smart people. I mean, fragile states do not mean that the people are any less smart than the people in all of the industrialized donor countries. They just have a worse environment to have to live in, which makes them even smarter. And when you walk in with a stabilization program, all of the stuff that it's cloaked in is this paternalistic sense that their systems are not good, that somehow they're not intelligent enough to be able to do this on their own, that somehow the donor countries know better than them how to do it. And that all just sort of gnaws at the dignity of people who probably have a completely different way of doing things. And so their own culture, their own informal systems are not given the respect that's needed for them to be able to make the solution. The fourth is unsustainable solutions reinforce failure and distract from accepting harder realities. So I'll use Afghanistan as a quick example. There's no way in probably my lifetime that Afghanistan is ever going to have the money to sustain the type of police and military system that the West has given them. We have created this expectation that, well, you need to have police, and they need to go around, and they need to make sure that all of the provinces are safe. It costs $2 billion to maintain that. And the realism of Afghanistan ever on its own being able to spend $2 billion a year to make sure that they have the resources, the cars, the uniforms, everything that they need to maintain a police station, it's not ever going to be there. So you've created something that will not be sustained, it will fall apart, and then that will throw them back into the same problem that will destroy the peace. The fifth point, don't show up to a knife fight with a stabilization program. When destabilizing elements use a stick, and this is exactly the same, kind of the same argument that my colleague made on why stabilization undermines peace, you have to use something that also resembles a stick in addition to the carrot. Stabilization is a carrot. Your enemy is causing terrorism and is enforcing, is using corruption and all of these other terrible tools to keep a state unstable and fragile in order to enrich themselves and in order to feed their own ideologies. And if you don't bring a stick to this fight and you try to use a carrot, it's going to get cut up pretty quickly. So that's my argument, and I'll look forward to the questions, but I do think it's a compelling argument, and I really, truly believe that stabilization does undermine peace.
Thank you so much, Ginger. Very powerful arguments. It gives me great pleasure to turn the floor now to Alan Doss to refute what you've been hearing, Alan, and to add your points.
Thanks very much, Scott, and I followed very closely the arguments made by the opposing team, but I still remain convinced that this motion is wrong. I don't believe that stabilization undermines peace. We have a tendency to take learn lessons from hard cases, and we hear a lot about the failures in Afghanistan and Iraq in particular, but true also in parts of Africa. But I think we draw the wrong lessons from those failures. I think we focus too much on those who've been providing the assistance rather than those who might be receiving it. The way the wars started in places like Afghanistan and particularly Iraq were doomed to failure from the outset. And this is part of the problem. We sort of are trying to use stabilization as an excuse for what has gone before, rather than seeing it as a pathway to the future. In my view, therefore, we need to build on stabilization, not reject it out of hand because of these cases where it's obviously gone badly wrong and very expensively wrong. And by the way, throwing money at problems is not the answer. I'm absolutely appalled by the amount of money that has gone into Afghanistan and Iraq. Billions, for what? You're right to say that. But is that because it was not properly planned, not properly understood, and above all, not anchored in local society? So I think three reasons are very important for why stabilization should continue. You need a link. You can't go from war to peace in one quick step. There is always a transition period. I think Ginger referred to the Marshall Plan in Europe. It worked because it was that transition from war-torn societies, bankrupt countries, devastated infrastructure, to self-mobilization. Most of the Marshall Plan, by the way, was not a gift. Most of it was in the form of loans, which were paid back. I think that's often forgotten. So I think we should see transition as that step, moving away from peace, from war to peace. And it's a transition that can work if we do it properly. The problem is we don't do it properly. We think that armed intervention is the answer. It's not. Armed intervention has its role, particularly in the early days when people feel insecure. But certainly it's not the answer. It has to be linked to political strategies that deal with the drivers of conflict. And I think that's what's been missing in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. And to a degree, I would argue, even in the Eastern Congo, where I was very, very familiar with it, we didn't have a political strategy to end conflict, to deal with the problem of mineral resource exploitation. So we struggled on trying to use military responses. That was not stabilization. It didn't destabilize, but equally well, it didn't solve the problem. Brings me to my second point, which is to use stabilization, if you will, as the first step towards the things we know that contribute to lasting peace. The rule of law, community-based reconciliation, protection of human rights, and more broadly, good governance. You cannot do that immediately, however willing the incoming government may be. An election doesn't change all of that. It takes time and it takes patience. And I see transition through stabilization as one of the ways of doing that. The third point I think I would emphasize is that stabilization should focus much more on practical effort to rebuild lives and livelihoods. People want to see change in their own lives. The great talk of in peace conferences and even donor conferences, how does it affect them? I used to have the title when I was in Sierra Leone as I had a very lofty title, which was the Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General for Governance and Stabilization, which is a very long title. And I would get introduced at events, protocol was very heavy in Sierra Leone. So they'd insist on all my titles and all the rest of it. So I said, let's get away from this. Just call me DSRSG GNS. So I was at a conference not long after that, and the moderator read out my name, Annan, etc., Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations FAAR, and he came to the GNS and he said, yes, he said, goods and services. And I thought that was a great point, because that's what people wanted to see. They wanted to see change in their life. They wanted to see not just that they could walk down the road for the first time in many years without being killed or raped, but they wanted to see improvement, kids in school, roads repaired, and so forth. So I think we neglect that too much. And that doesn't require trillions of dollars. Quite the opposite. I would say trillions of dollars are the worst thing you can do, because then people focus on the big numbers and not on the $100, $200, $300 that can make a big difference in the lives of people who make that country, or will be the future of that country. So I see stabilization, if you will, as a down payment on a better future. It's not guaranteed by any means, but it's there. We have to make the most of it. And as I said, throwing trillions of dollars isn't necessarily the answer. So I would like you not to vote for this motion, which I think is not what we need. I have no illusions that stabilization is not a panacea, but it's also not a mirage. It can happen. I've worked in countries it's happened, Sierra Leone, Liberia to name two. So, as I said, please believe in stabilization. It can work, it does work, and it will work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan, for those powerful arguments. I think we're going to have an interesting debate. Kwesi, we heard Almut mention some powerful cases from history of where stabilization has worked. But she also said that we don't have a common definition of stabilization, which actually you echoed in your presentation as well. What is the proper measure of stabilization? Forget definitions, but what should we be using as a yardstick to measure the effectiveness of stabilization over time?
I think to come to grips with this, we need to ask one very fundamental question. Why and how do states become weak, fragile, and eventually to collapse, and sometimes into extreme violence? What people do need when states are being rebuilt like Humpty Dumpty is that first and foremost, the very components of states, first communities, must be rebuilt and recreated in a manner that draws on the positives within those communities. What is it that makes communities resilient? What is it that can contribute to helping communities regenerate themselves? And here I want to talk about two things. First, the role of women, recognizing the role that women play in holding the family together during periods of instability. Creating opportunities for simple, easy to maintain and develop livelihoods. When societies that respect their women and create opportunities for them to rebuild the family and keep them stable. Then communities are able to regenerate themselves. Norms, values, and principles inherent in strengthening and building those communities begin to grow and strengthen or begin to get stronger. And then that expands over time. When we talk about state strength, particularly in this part of the world where I live and work, what people forget that state strength and state effectiveness is really about community effectiveness and community strength. It is from the community that state institutions and their leaders get their strength. So that is where we should be focusing on, creating opportunities for microfinance, microcredit, better seats, and giving women a critical voice in how their communities must be governed.
Alan, about this DDR issue that Kwesi raised.
Yes, well, I think DDR takes many forms in different. I've been in various peace missions, peace operations, and DDR has taken a different form in each one, if you will. But certainly the notion that you would just automatically enroll ex-combatants into the forces, state forces, is a mistake. I mean, I would agree with that, and I've always been against that. Some places it's been the price of peace, because as in the case of the DRC, the agreement, the Sun City agreements that led to the reunification of the country, withdrawal of foreign forces, it happened because basically everybody agreed that their fighting forces, their militias, could be a part of the armed forces of the Congo. I mean, it was in effect a gigantic form of communal bribe. It was a mistake, and it's continued on. You know, each time there's been an outburst of violence. In fact, it became a perverse incentive, because the reintegration of those ex-combatants into the armed forces led to awarding of ranks of those who were bringing them in. So if you brought in X number, you'd get a colonel. If you brought in a higher number, you might get a brigadier, and above that, a general. Well, of course, there's no incentive. And the next time violence erupted, some of the ex-militia would leave, only to be re-enrolled sometime later. So it was a revolving door, DDR, and a failure. Much better examples were in Sierra Leone and Liberia. The case of Liberia, the armed forces were actually abolished. And anybody applying for the new armed forces had to go through a very serious vetting process. Sierra Leone didn't go down that route. They retrained the armed forces under a special arrangement called the IMAT. And they did allow ex-combatants to apply. Very few got in because, again, there was a very strict vetting process, both for those who were serving, but also for those who wanted to apply. Some did, and they've done reasonably well, I understand. But it depends. I think if you have wholesale recruitment of demobilized, then you're asking for trouble. We've seen this again in Cote d'Ivoire with mutinies. There's been problems there because there wasn't a really thorough vetting process. I understand the reasons for it. Security is fragile. Country's not yet fully reunified in a real sense. Reconciliation hasn't happened. So there's hesitation about really getting rid of those who are loyal, if you will. But they're the same forces that have created problems since, in small numbers, true. So I think, yes, DDR is a step in stabilization, but it depends how it's done, and it certainly has to be part of a broader array of measures that can build confidence in the population. Bearing in mind also that the armed forces, by and large, in most African countries, I have to say Ghana is probably a happy exception, and not just because Kwesi is there, have no confidence in their armed forces. They see them as forces of intimidation and rapacity, and not as there to protect. They're there to protect the regime at most, not to protect the country or the people.
Thank you very much, Alan. Question back to Ginger. Ginger, you gave some powerful testimony about how destructive stabilization has been in a country like Iraq. Well, assuming the fall of Saddam Hussein had taken place already, And instead of a stabilization mission, what would you have proposed? What would have been a different path for Iraq that could have been more successful?
There's a couple of things that, looking back at the Iraq example specifically, that could have been done differently. I think the first thing that a lot of people are afraid to say, especially in forums like this, is that there wasn't enough power used. The US government and the coalition sent in military forces, and at the point that they disbanded the army and let the military go and people started to loot and cause problems, everybody stood back and let it happen. And there was this sense that somehow there wasn't order. And so without clamping down at the very beginning, people then just started to run away with what was going to happen. So part of the problem that people kind of look back and criticize was the fact that not enough force was used. Because if you look at the idea of using more force at the beginning to spare the hundreds of thousands of lives that were lost over this protracted 15-year death every single month for years and years, if you would have just gone in, cleaned out the insurgents, had a strong military presence in the beginning and taken a strong military stand in the beginning against the combatants, that perhaps it would have put in place a more fearsome system that would have aligned more with a mentality that had been already sort of ruined by Saddam Hussein. People were waiting for a strong man to come and tell them what to do. And when nobody was there telling them what to do, things went crazy, and it's kind of never gone back to being orderly anymore. Everybody's gone crazy. I think the second thing is the systems in Iraq, the informal systems, were never really allowed to develop. In this particular case, the United States and donor countries as well, but primarily the United States, came in, put in the systems, designed them, and they just didn't fit. And that has been an enduring cause for problems. I mean, examples, the United States' use of sectarian division has resulted in a rise of sectarianism that now has not gone away. It's starting to mitigate a little bit, but it's been the source of problems for 15 years. Democracy, well, it'll be nice if it eventually succeeds, but I mean, Iraq has had no government for almost as long as it's had a government, because democracy is just not something that in its pure sense really fits. It has to be tailored, and it just hasn't worked. And finally, oversight. I mean, we created inspectors general because we wanted there to be oversight so there wouldn't be corruption. And the oversight just turned into more corruption. So in today's world, the inspector general will tell companies, well, I won't report you and I won't throw you in jail for corruption if you pay me a bribe. So it goes back to letting a society make hard decisions, not holding them by the hand, but going in hard and then pulling back and letting a society build itself and use its own experiences and its own culture to build a solution that will be sustainable and that will last.
Almut, for the last word of this round of this debate.
I have been listening carefully to the other team, of course also to Annan. I have to say I'm really not convinced as of now that stabilization undermines peace. I think the point they get wrong is that they talk about practical examples, things that have happened, but not about the policy as such. So I understand that spending as a proxy for success is wrong, but that doesn't mean that the stabilization approach is wrong. It's not the wrong policy, but it's the wrong way to do it, or that we have done it. And I have mentioned the problems in Afghanistan, and we have learned from Ginger about Iraq and other places. So it's not the policy as such as was wrong, but we have just thrown money at problems, and we've been doing peacekeeping in places where there was no peace to keep. And the conclusion is no more money does not mean better policy. But the issue is that we have to get the policy right. We have to do better expectation management. We have definitely to create more ownership. We have to partner with the people and the governments in the respective countries that we want to work in or that we want to support, oftentimes in our interest. And we have to be clear about this and transparent about this. We don't do that because we're better people, but there's something that it's also in our interest why we do these stabilization efforts. And we shouldn't hide that. And the main issue, to my point, is we can talk about whatever policy and approaches and stuff, but if there's no political will behind these efforts, whether it's stabilization or anything else, it will never ever change a situation in a country to the better. It will never ever create sustainable peace. We need the political will. And stabilization is one good policy, one good approach. It could work, but whatever we do, if there's no political will, there will be no stabilization, there will be no peace efforts. So my point, money is not the solution. Political will, creating ownership, and getting the policy right.
Well, thank you to our wonderful speakers for their strong arguments. We're now joined by a keynote listener, Sven-Eric Söder, the Director General of the Folke Bernadotte Academy, who's going to ask each team one question. Sven-Eric, over to you.
Thank you very much, Scott, and also thank you to all for panelists for your utmost interesting contributions. Well, my role as key listener is to address one question to each team. I will base my questions on some facts, because believe it or not, we are actually living in a less violent world today, at least in terms of fatalities. And according to figures from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, the number of fatalities in organized violence decreased the last year for the 5th consecutive year, and we're now reaching an all-time low since 2011. But that trend doesn't correspond with the number of conflicts. The number of conflicts is on an all-time high level right now, and 50% of all conflicts involves ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And I think that's very important to keep in mind when we are talking about stabilization and stabilization efforts. So my questions are based on those facts. So first, I turn to the team arguing for the motion that stabilization undermines peace. So my question to you, my friends, is there in your mind really a realistic and functioning alternative to stabilization efforts? And if so, how do we, without robust stabilization efforts, confront and deal with extremist actors such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda? So that's my first question. And my second question to the other team arguing against the motion that stabilization undermines peace is, if we believe that stabilization fulfills an important and sometimes imperative role for the task at hand, how can stabilization be tailored to better contribute to sustainable peace? And please, if possible, with lessons learned from success stories that you have mentioned, what lessons can we learn or can be learned from, for example, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and the Western Balkans? Thank you.
Thank you, Sven-Eric. So our speakers are going to have 2 minutes each to both answer Sven-Eric's important question and to make their closing arguments about why they deserve your vote and why the other team is wrong. So we're going to turn first to Kwesi Aning, and then to Dr. Almut Wieland-Karimi, then to Ginger Cruz, and then we'll finish with Alan. So in the same order as last time. But before we do, I need to ask our audience to cast your vote now. You were asked to vote at the beginning of this session, and we have the results of those here, but I need you to cast your vote now, and we're going to compare the results at the end of these final statements to see who has been more persuasive as a team. For your information, the team arguing for the motion that stabilization undermines peace received 49.2% of the vote, which means that the team arguing against the motion received 50.8%. So we're neck and neck in this battle for your vote. So I turn the floor now to Kwesi Aning to make his final statement and argument and to answer Sven-Eric's question.
Well, thank you very much. We're asking you to support our motion that stabilization undermines peace and to vote for us for a couple of reasons. One, stabilization of operations have neither fulfilled their promise nor their ambitions. And I want to thank our opponents for actually supporting our arguments with the facts and information that they provided, because they provided a lot of convincing arguments that stabilization is very problematic. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, lives do matter. Stabilization ought to be about recreating societies and about protecting lives. But you cannot do that when the operation itself has not been defined and its boundaries not known. So far, were stabilization to be a private sector venture, the billions that have been used would have been questioned. Those monies have not transformed lives and they have not transformed society. But they've created alternative economies and power hierarchies that have in the medium to long term contributed to creating instability. Let me come to the question itself of realistic or alternatives and confronting the extreme. Stabilization operations have failed woefully to recreating strong economies of bringing people together and recreating the resilience in societies and communities. I am arguing for hybrid alternatives in which ordinary people are brought together around the table, people whose lives need to be changed, communities that ought to be protected. Those are the things that stabilization has failed and actually has contributed to undermining. My argument and our argument is that we hope we have convinced you to vote for us in the next round. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kwesi. Now we're going to hear from Almut, who is arguing against the motion that stabilization undermines peace. Almut.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Sven-Eric, for your question. I have to say I listened properly to what you, Ginger, and Kwesi have been saying. It's interesting arguments, but I do disagree, because I really believe that stabilization supports peace. And why? And answering Sven-Eric's question, I think over the past 25 years, we have really more clarity that stabilization is not about military endeavor. It's a political endeavor. It's political. That is important. The idea is to create space, especially for local actors, to then be able to create a conducive environment to have sustainable peace in their environment. And Ginger, you're talking about money and you're talking about the carrots. It doesn't solve problems to throw money at problems. I totally agree with this part of it. However, stabilization is not about throwing money at people. Stabilization is about the political will. It's about the political will of the actors on the ground, of the actors in the international community, and to have a coherent strategy in how to bring about peace or how to bring about stabilization. So talking about the political will, I agree it's not the concept that is wrong, but the political interest has to be sustainable as well. You need endurance. It's exit too early, for example, on the Western Balkans, that was your question, Sven-Eric, then of course it's not going to work. You don't declare victory and go because you have an election at home or something else. So it's not the policy that we're getting wrong, it's the way we implement it. And for the wrong political reasons, at least to my understanding.
Thank you, Almut. I just want to make sure that any last votes get in now because we're closing the voting in the next few seconds. So now we're going to turn back to Ginger Cruz, who is arguing for the motion that stabilization undermines peace. Ginger.
Thank you very much, and my utmost respect to everybody, but I do have to once again argue that this motion makes a lot of sense. We really need you to vote in favor of it, and here's the reason why. The other team has agreed that you don't pour money on a solution. So if you're not pouring money and you don't have a lot of money to put into the solution, how are you going to intervene? One of the anecdotes that I'll give, there was an interview a couple days ago on the media of the head of the Interior Ministry of Iraq. And there was a discussion I had with him about a $1.2 billion project that the United States was giving to them to help them to develop security. And he said, you know what? Tell the United States to keep the $1.2 billion, because what's going to happen is $1 billion of it is going to go for the security and the housing and the food and the PowerPoints of the team that's going to come in. And really only 200,000 of it, or 200 million of it, is going to go to any sort of help for our country. And frankly, it's a lot of effort, but we're not going to get a lot of it. And so why doesn't the United States just keep that money? And that's an anecdote, again, for, you know, it's one thing not to pour money on a country, but at the same time, a stabilization effort in and of itself needs the resources in order to be put in place. And so to go to Sven-Eric's question, so the answer is, if it's not stabilization, then what is it? And I think one of the things we really need to do is we need to have faith in the people of a fragile state, that if you put the limited resources you have in ensuring the security and having a military that can hold the security, and then you actually pull back and let that fragile state in its own unique and informal way find the solution that works for them. Don't impose it. Don't bring it as a model or best practice from outside, but let them find it on their own. It may be messy, but that's the way that you'll achieve stabilization.
Thank you so much, Ginger. So now for the final word, we're turning to Alan Doss, who is arguing against the motion that stabilization undermines peace. Alan.
Well, thank you very much. As the voting is closed, I guess my words won't count terribly much, but I do want to reiterate my support for stabilization and to answer also the specific question of Sven-Eric. I say this because we keep confusing militarization with stabilization. It is not the same thing. There may be a military phase, but that's not enough. We have to go into stabilization, which is about building trust and building confidence, which are the essential building blocks that you need for peace building. And we tried to do that in Liberia and Sierra Leone. We didn't rely exclusively on military force, and God knows we didn't have trillions of dollars. In fact, it's probably a good thing that we didn't. We focused on building legitimacy and the services that could deliver for the people. Unfortunately, we had interlocutors who we could do that with, both in Liberia and Sierra Leone. It was important to have that national leadership, that legitimate national leadership. And we did that, frankly, in part by supporting valid elections that were not crooked elections. Of course, there were losers and winners, but that was a very important starting point. So again, I'd like to emphasize, stabilization is a down payment on the future. It's the pathway out of war and violent conflict towards, hopefully, a peaceful and more durable future based on trust and confidence. This is why working on stabilization is absolutely vital in my view, to prepare for the future, not to simply dwell on the past, but to learn from the past and make sure that stabilization, the way it's created, the way it's managed, and the way it's taken forward, really builds on what we've learned and simply doesn't fall back into repeating the past. That is what good stabilization is about. It's not about having hundreds of thousands of troops, and it's not about having trillions of dollars. You need to build trust, you need to build confidence, and stabilization is the way to do that. So please vote against the motion, even though it's now too late. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. So while our team is compiling the votes for the final tally, I just want to recap. So if you agree that with Kwesi and Ginger, that stabilization is a confused concept, that the use of robust force by these missions actually undermines the credibility of these missions in terms of building peace. If you believe that these missions impose foreign systems of justice
and security that are inappropriate for these societies, or that it actually creates massive opportunities for corruption and dependencies that make solutions unsustainable, then you will have voted for the motion that stabilization undermines peace. However, if you agreed with Almut and Alan, that where you acknowledge that stabilization might be flawed, but what Kwesi and Ginger have been saying is a bit unfair, that stabilization all too often is missing an important political strategy, yes, that yes, it uses timelines and spending as a measure of success rather than benchmarks, but that you recognize that stabilization is essential to transition from violent conflict to non-violent conflict management, which is essential to building trust and legitimacy and sustainable peace, then you would have voted against the motion that stabilization undermines peace. So we have the final tally, and what I see here is very interesting. So just as a reminder, that where we started was with 49.2% in favor of the motion that stabilization undermines peace, and against the motion is 50.8%. We now have a quite stark move in favor of the against team. The against team has been more persuasive in winning over votes from the audience, from the first vote to the second vote. So let me just congratulate the against team who said that stabilization does not undermine peace for having won this debate. Congratulations, and join me in clapping for them. All right, congratulations, Alan, Almut. You were the most persuasive team. And thank you, Kwesi and Ginger, for your participation. Thank you, Sven-Eric, for your questions. We recognize that the speakers, none of them have very black and white views on the matter, as you heard. These are very nuanced issues, and we were hoping that this debate, in an exaggerated way, on such a controversial motion, would actually bring out the strong arguments on both sides, and it did just that. So we hope that you both enjoyed it and found it enlightening. So thank you to all our speakers, thank you to the organizers, and this brings the session to a close.
Thank you.
Thank you.